Okay. There we go. Okay, so the language development, when I first started these lessons, I always thought I was doing a good job of focusing on that. But like I said up here, when I got more comfortable with the planning and looking at all the strategies we learned, I realized I had a lot of work to do to make sure I'm focusing on their language development every lesson, whether it's math, reading, writing, everything. So as the lessons went on, I focused more and more on the language development and how that can also help support all the learning that we do no matter what subject it is, because in elementary we have to teach every subject. So that's always tricky. And the ways I increased focus on language development is I grouped the students based off their proficiency, especially like on their K-ALPHA or what I noticed in the classroom. So I would maybe have a high EL learner and maybe one that speaks more Spanish, and they could really help each other out. I allowed students to work collaboratively. That is something I do all the time in my classroom, is they're always in groups working unless it's like a test or whatever. I also allowed students to speak in their native language as needed to help clarify questions, because I'm realizing that's a big thing. My kids are so comfortable in speaking in Spanish, which is great, but I need them to speak in English, but sometimes I just can't quite get the translation from one to the other. So they were able to talk to each other and kind of help each other through that. And then a lot of the strategies we learned throughout this course also helped with their language development. The student interaction and oral language, that's something that happens a lot in my classroom because, like I said, we work collaboratively a lot, so they're always talking. We do lots of presentations. I use Google Classroom, so they do lots of Google Slides. So the oral language is something that happens a lot. I, again, had them in cooperative groups, and it allowed them to interact with their content area, but also build upon each other's knowledge and using their oral language. So I had one kiddo who couldn't say a vocabulary word correct, and he kept saying it wrong every single time. And his partner kind of corrected him just by saying it correctly, and was like, "Oh, you mean this word?" And he would say it, and they'd be like, "Yeah, that word." So that worked really well. And then I also ask a lot of questions that students need to answer. And they read stories and definitions and directions. I don't do a lot of the reading in my class. We do it all together. They're always the ones reading and talking orally or reading directions. And it helps when they hear themselves reading with me because they can correct the words as they need to. My assessments for the 4 different areas for speaking, like I said, we do lots of partner and group work, and I assess how they talk with each other. And if they use English that was mostly correct and understandable, I'm not looking for them to do 100% because I just don't feel like that is something that's ever going to happen. So I have a checklist with students' names and for each lesson, like how they did working with their group, how they did speaking, do I understand what they were trying to say. Listening, it's kind of the same thing. Listening to one another, that is so hard for 5th graders. Because they either want to listen and correct everything the other person said, or they just don't want to listen at all. And so that one is really hard for them. And listening and understanding correct English, sometimes when I would be reading sentences out of books, they wouldn't understand what it meant because it used very proper, grammatically correct English, and that was really hard for them. So I use the checklist again, like were they understanding what that was trying to say or were they not, and how they were listening to each other. Reading, every lesson had some sort of reading section, whether it was vocabulary or comprehension. The 4 lessons I did were all reading based, but during math we also do vocabulary and word walls and different things. So I assess reading by looking at their graphic organizer, their weekly test, because we have to give a weekly test, and listening to their discussions and if they were comprehending what they were reading in English, and any other worksheets we also did related to reading. And then writing, my students do a lot of writing or typing. Nowadays they don't do a lot of handwriting, it's actually typing, but it's still the same thing. And the students wrote in every lesson, whether it was, again, on graphic organizer or vocabulary sentences, and I looked at their writing by the grammar that was used and if they were able to even convey their ideas and understanding, because maybe they couldn't put it into words correctly, but if I at least knew that they were able to try and write what they were trying to say, then that's awesome. So lesson plan number 1. It was a comprehension-based lesson plan, and I used Think, Pair, Share to discuss comprehension questions from our weekly reading. And I also used a graphic organizer for students to organize their thinking. The lesson went well, but the students didn't really get super engaged because I felt like it wasn't graphic organizers think, pair, share. That's something we use a lot in our classroom, so it wasn't something new and exciting. But it was nice that the students got to talk to each other and kind of help build their knowledge. Lesson plan 2 was a vocabulary-based lesson plan. I feel like in elementary, especially with the new reading curriculum that we do, I have been piloting that, and vocabulary is really big. You do it the first day, you review it every day after for at least 10 to 15 minutes a day. So we use the vocabulary 4 corners, and the students we went over the vocab words. This was the introduction, and they picked 2 or 3 that were going to be hard for them and got to make 2 or 3 vocab 4 corners, and they loved it, and my students loved it. Or I loved it and my students loved it. And it was awesome because not all my students picked the same words to focus on, so they got to have some really good collaborative discussion of why did you pick this word, or oh, this word's easy, this makes me think of this. So they were able to help each other build connections. And the results on their tests were great for all the words they chose that they needed to work on. So it would be awesome if I could do it for every word, but we have 10 vocabulary words a week. So
overwhelming.
Yeah. So it was nice for them to be able to self-reflect and pick what words that they needed. Lesson plan 3. This one was the hardest for them, but it was probably one of the most engaging ones as well, because it was grammar and figurative language, like proverbs and different sayings. So that was really, really hard for them. We made a poster, kind of like a one-pager type thing, based off of each figurative language. It was like a 4-corner, one-pager all combined together. My students kind of helped me come up with it because they like to do a lot of group work and posters. And so it was great to have all my students working together. The discussions they had were great, and most of them made connections to their language and some proverbs that they may have in Spanish. So they have different sayings that they would tell me, like, oh, that's kind of like this one in Spanish, or they'd have crazy ones that I was like, what does that even mean? So I kind of understood how they felt too on some of ours, like the early bird gets the worm, that like threw them for a loop, even though they hear it a lot. And this lesson really focused on the writing, speaking, and listening. And then my last one, this was probably actually my favorite, but we did the somebody who with our vocabulary words. This was our review on day 4, the day before they take their test. The vocabulary 4 corners and sentence starters. And to find someone who didn't just have their 10 vocabulary words, it also had some of the other vocab words we needed to focus on because it was a really heavy-hitting science article that we were reading. So there was like, I think, fossils and archaeologists, maybe different things like that, just because they needed to know what that was going to be about. The Find Someone Who went way better than I thought it would. They really enjoyed getting to interact with each other, and the kids would explain their words in different ways. And then at the end, they used the 4 corners again, and they were really excited to pick one word or 2 words that they didn't quite feel they had down yet. And they got to create the poster, and they talked again with each other about why did you pick that word, I picked it because, or I didn't pick that word. And so that's when the discussion starters came in, because I realized that was kind of a weakness for my kids, is using that I disagree because, or I agree. They would just say, no, it's this, or whatever. And the vocab test was, again, awesome. I think almost every kid got anywhere from 80 to 100% on it. So that was really good. Differentiation is something that happens every day in my classroom because I have 5 IEPs out of 19 students, and 4 of them are ELLs. So I differentiate a lot, and it just so happens that I have to differentiate for content and language. They have to have both differentiated. And that's kind of difficult sometimes. So one way I differentiated is during the vocabulary lessons. That does not make sense. I have a student who has been here since he was 7, and he is very low. He reads at a 1st grade level, and we're, well, not even a 1st grade level. He still reads nonsense words in 5th grade, and so he also has a hard time in Spanish, but it's easier for him in Spanish, so he's really tricky. So I helped for the 4 corners. I helped him come up with the sentences, and I helped write a lot of it, so he could focus on making the connections to the pictures, because that's where he makes the greatest connections. And then and also coming up with words that may mean the same. And I also allowed him, if he came up with a word that meant the same in Spanish, since I don't know Spanish words, he could ask one of his buddies if it really meant the same, and if it did, we would write it down. Like, I was fine with him making that connection in Spanish, because he didn't have any connection at all. And another way I differentiated is during the figurative language lesson, certain groups got proverbs that they hear more often. And so that kind of helped. Those were some of my lower ELs that could help, and that helped them talk about it with each other and focus on the meaning and what it really means. And then I feel like I became a better teacher throughout the course of this class because I got so many strategies. And I also realized those strategies helped my ELs and my English speakers, because my English speakers love the vocabulary four squares just as much as my ELL students. And I also learned that I need to do better about writing concise objectives for students to easily understand. I just have a hard time with writing objectives and posting them. I normally just say, like, in math we're doing lesson 6 and it's about decimals. So it really made me realize I need to be more concise about that. And then I also learned other differentiation techniques, and that some students will need more support than others based off of their language, and that just because I have 12 ELL students in my class, maybe only 3 of them are going to really need the discussion starters. And I think that's it.
Awesome. Who wants to go next?
I'll go next.
All right. And I forgot, I've got minute cards, but now I can't find them. If anybody wants me to use them, if you want to know how long you're going.
And it'll be much faster.
Is this you? Yeah, there it is.
This is the clicker. All right. Just want to make a point really fast. This class was interesting to me because, like, you guys teach high school, you teach 5th grade, and I teach, like, the babies. But it's fascinating because all of these strategies are so easily applicable to my kids, and you guys have some of like the same problems that I have with my kids. It cracks me up sometimes. And it was fun for me because, you know, you'd always use like high school examples, but I would always think, okay, how can I use this, you know, with my kiddos? All right. Increasing focus on language development to support content learning. And I just kind of bullet pointed my ideas. This class made me much more aware of how really important vocabulary is. And I think up until this year, I hadn't put enough focus on it in my teaching. So I really focus more on explicit instruction of vocabulary. And, you know, that backs up to just like purposeful planning, like what's going to be my vocabulary? Like this is important. They're not going to understand this if I don't teach them what this word means. And I've, especially in math, I feel like I've done a lot better with that and just adding more math terms to our word wall as well. And science, and of course there's always reading words. And just like students' understanding of the language, having them make sense of the words through speaking with partners and collaboration. A lot of the times they draw out what the word means and they have a lot of fun doing that, and then also writing using the words in a sentence. I use visual aids for vocabulary as well. So I have pictures with the word, and I have that on a word wall. And just a lot of use of vocabulary throughout each lesson, which I kind of already mentioned. Making sure that when we come across words that are important to the objective, I really stress it, and so they understand what that means. And then just vocabulary checks for understanding as well, like when I'm teaching my lesson, like about equal quantities or something, going back and saying they are equal. What's equal? Oh, it's the same. Just constantly checking, what does this word mean? It means this, so that they really grasp it. And then really I just tried to make it like less teacher forward. I know that sounds a little weird, but I just really pushed like students reading, writing, and speaking in every subject, because I think it's so easy to get, like in math, like you're trying to get this and this and this and this, and just you reading the question. But really I just tried to become, which is something our MTSS facilitator at Ortiz told us, less helpful, which sounds weird, but I think it's actually worked really well because they're required to do the reading. And when you require them to do that, they're required to do the reading, the speaking, you give those expectations, they can really meet them, even first graders. And then a lot of peer collaboration, just speaking and using that language with one another. Student interaction and use of oral language. I do this through small group instruction. Students can obviously interact more when you are teaching smaller groups. So both my course, Math Core, Reading Core, they are divided into 2 groups. So I'm just working with a smaller set of kids. And then their interaction, like, they build confidence from that, first of all. They're not having to speak in front of a whole group of people. And so their collaboration really increased with small group instruction. Established partners, we call them peanut butter and jelly partners. You guys probably don't use that term, but they know who their partner is. They can find them within 2 seconds, and it's like constant partner talk. And I never used, I have done it so much more this year. And in the past, I didn't use it a whole lot because I always thought, oh, we're wasting time, but just a realization of how important that component is, them speaking with their partner, really they gain so much insight from that. Also, use of collaboration games, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with. 4 Corners, Find a Friend. I think I kind of made that one up. But it's like find someone who, except they find a friend, and we've focused so much on like reading fluency, like they find a friend and they have to read the sentence to their friend, and then their friend can kind of correct them or help them where needed. Think, pair, share, stuff like that. Sentence stems really help a lot with oral language with my kiddos as well, because once they have that support, then they feel more comfortable saying the whole sentence that I require. Like, what did you learn from this story? I learned that, instead of just them telling me randomly. So we use a whole lot of sentence stems, like on every vocabulary PowerPoint as well. Visual aids. My classroom is covered in anchor charts. I don't know about you guys, but it's just plastered with anchor charts with the language that they need to be using. And I know it helps because they look for it. When they're not there, they're looking for it. And just purposeful planning. You know, I hopefully, as any good teacher would, just planning out the whole week and then understanding where would be a good time to collaborate, and then I go in and make my more detailed plans day by day. And I think that really helps me find places to fit that student interaction. That can be done in a timely manner as well. All right, how do I assess the 4 language domains? It's a whole lot of informal. I feel like a whole lot of informal assessment. My reading is monitored better through my use of small group instruction. When you're only dealing with a group of 5 or 6, you can obviously tell who's reading and who's not. It's also monitored during independent tasks. So when students, ask for help, I have them read the question to me first before I read it. Speaking is monitored auditorily by me during like peer collaboration and partner talk discussions. Like, I don't just sit there and be a bummer. I walk around and I pick up on what they're saying, and it's kind of cute because when I get closer, they're like, they start talking more. So that's how I monitor a lot. I've recorded conversations too, like on my iPads when they're doing like peer collaboration. I monitor for listening skills. They probably hate this. This probably makes me the worst teacher, but I frequently ask students to repeat what their partner said or their peer said during oral discussions, which sometimes it's funny because it throws them for a loop because they're like, oh, yeah, I didn't listen to what they said. And then I also monitor listening skills by having students repeat what I said, and that could be, a whole class, what did I say? And sometimes I'll call on that one person that I know was looking at the back of the room instead of me, but it works. They listen better. And then also I use formal assessments. I assess written language through graphic organizers. I use a lot of those. They have writing journals, exit tickets, sticky notes, writing on whiteboards. Sometimes I take pictures of what they're writing on their whiteboards. I did it today. I think they wrote something down, and I took a picture of it because I had these little books, so yeah. All right. Some fun strategies that I use in each of my lessons. And I apologize, I didn't really put the reflection of my lesson on here. I know I did that on the discussion board, but I'll kind of go over it. So my first lesson the lesson was about comparing quantities in math and finding the difference between the 2 quantities, like how many more does have than So one of the strategies we used was just making an action. I love using actions all the time in my class. We made an action for the word compare to help us remember what students need to do when they're reading those compare problems, when they're finding the difference between quantities. Okay, we talked about seeing what's the same and then finding the difference. And it was fairly helpful. I mean, some students that was still clear over their heads, that whole concept, but definitely my medium, high group, I saw them kind of doing the action and then they started to figure it out. That objective was really hard. Those are some really hard math problems, so I'd say making an action was pretty effective, but it's still just a hard concept. Lesson 2 was a reading assignment where they compared basically character traits and then talked about how characters were similar and different. And so we used a graphic organizer here, and really this lesson, it's funny when I write these lesson plans because they kind of, some of them extend like over the week with these little kids. So the graphic organizer we made these compare posters where they took notes on the traits of 2 different characters. One character, Olivia, was on one side, and then Tacky the Penguin was on the other side. And then in the middle of the poster, they wrote on how the characters were the same and how they were different. And they were able to go back and look at how they were the same. And they even put like little stars over what traits were the same and which ones were different. In lesson 3, this was a science lesson over, man, I'm sorry, I'm just realizing we do so much comparing in first grade over the similarities and differences between animals and their offspring. So for this, we used a whole lot of collaboration. That was the strategy used here. And hand up, pair up, share, that was a big one. So half of the students were given adult animal cards and half were given corresponding offspring cards. And students had to find their partner and discuss the similarities and differences of the mama or papa animal and the baby animal, of the words that they used. I did not use the word offspring there. Lesson 4 was a writing lesson. And the strategy used here, the big one was visual aids, anchor charts. I got to use a lot of those when it comes to writing. Basically, we had to do it. Our objective, our culminating writing assessment was over opinion writing. So students, we're doing it over our summer bucket list because, you know, it's time for some fun lessons. And so they gave examples of their opinions and reason to support them, and then we collected ideas on a large anchor chart to help them with the writing process, which is proven effective when it comes to their writing. I'd say about 70% of them know that they need to, 80% of them, give an opinion that includes a reason. That's a big thing that we stressed. So, going on, a couple examples of differentiation. Tiered groups, I think, would be my main thing in my classroom. I break core instruction in math and reading into small groups. I base these small groups on pre-assessment scores. We do pre-assessments. In math core, we do pre-assessments before each module. We could do them before each topic, but we do them before each math module. And then, and reading fluency, or reading core, I base my tier groups based on our FastBridge scores. Do you guys, thumbs up if you know what FastBridge is, or do you have, okay, so you guys do it in high school? Mm-hmm. Okay, I didn't know that. So that's a good data point to look at to help me tier my reading core groups. And then this way, I have students that can be independent, you know, I have students that need way more support. They get me, and then I have kids, you know, that are kind of in the middle. They're still getting parent support, they're still getting support where needed. I also use a lot of visuals and manipulatives. During instruction and assessments, I provide extra visual support and manipulatives for my lower tiered groups. Usually this includes things as like word banks, sentence stems that are already, you know, typed in, anchor charts, counters, cubes sometimes. Like I know we were working on the make 10 strategy in math, and my lower tiered group, they weren't able to show with a number bond how you make 10. That's kind of crazy. Like you see 9 plus 8, so you make 10 with the 9, you pull the 1 out of 8, so it's really 10 plus 7. That's abstract for them. So I let them use cubes, and they were so successful when they used those cubes. So it's little things like that, and we were we had tangram one day that we were supposed to make. They were supposed to put the shape back together, and my higher tiered math group, they didn't get the visual, but my lower tiered math group did. Just little things like that. And then reflection on teaching. This course has really taught me that vocabulary is really key through all content. Without the development of language, students will kind of flatline, and I've seen that. I also learned, it was mentioned in one of, I think it was the Myths and Realities book, that productive struggle, like when they read something and they read it wrong, and then they go back and read it again but correct it, which drives me a little crazy because I'm like, come on, you need to get a higher score, you know, is really good. And I learned that I really just need to give think time and wait time and let them correct themselves, because, you know, that's when their brain is growing. That's really the growth mindset there. Also just giving support without taking away the rigor. I just came to understand it's okay to slow down the pace. It's something that we talked about here when needed, and put scaffolds where needed just to keep, but I just need to keep the objective the same. And then collaboration and investigation is so important. Students need to interact with others to build the language development and investigate other students' language to learn more from them. So, yep, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Awesome.
I'll go next.
All right.
Wind up.
Okay, so for language development, for me, all of my lessons are in the same unit, which was about quadratics, solving them, graphing them, all that stuff. So some strategies I use throughout my unit is sentence stems, word banks. I always have a word wall, but I feel like I was able to use it a little more effectively. Turn and talk, my kids are in partners all the time, so turn and talk is just a big thing we do pretty much consistently every day. And I started the unit with a lot of vocab, so I made it vocab heavy in the first lesson, and then we kind of sprinkled it throughout. For student interaction, again, my kids are always in pairs, so they always have a partner right there beside them. When I group my pairs, I try to do high-low for the most part with their math skills. And like I said, we already do a ton of turn and talks, and I already do a ton of pairing up to share answers before they answer out loud, and then also requiring words from the word wall to be used rather than just having them up there. So assessing the 4 domains for listening, the kids have a workbook this year, so they have to take a lot of notes in the workbook, and they have to be able to listen. A lot of times I have students repeat directions to me if I know they're not paying attention, like, hey, what did I just say? And also words back to me. The word parabola was hard for even my non-ESOL kids, so we said that one a lot. Monomial, trinomial, binomial, those were all kind of difficult for them too. So for reading, we highlight a lot while we break down a word problem. And the workbook is very language heavy, and it's really hard to decipher for the kids. So if the word problem is especially long, I just highlight what they need, and that's all we read from it. For writing, we do a ton of sentence stems because the workbook is a lot of, okay, here's the information, now let's decipher it, let's put it to good practice, that sort of thing. So I give them a lot of sentence stems. Exit tickets, I like to do where they just write something down and then stick it on the whiteboard as they leave. So I already am doing a lot of that with the writing. For math, writing looks a little bit different sometimes because it's writing a problem, not necessarily writing a sentence. For speaking, like I said, I do a ton of turn and talk already because those kids are in the partners pretty much the whole day. A lot of sharing out answers. I do some cold calling, and then sometimes I will also tell a kid like, hey, I'm going to call on you for number 5. Have your answer ready for me. And I'll check it, give him a little confidence boost. Hey, you got the right answer. Now you just got to say it out loud. And I do a lot of proximity. I teach 2 double block freshman Algebra 1 classes, which is remedial. And if they didn't have proximity, I don't think we'd get anything done. So I am close to them as often as I can be. And I have a para in one of my rooms and a tutor in the other one. So for lesson 1, I introduced what a polynomial is and how to name them. This was the vocab heavy lesson that I started with, and I broke down the root word and the prefixes, which is kind of that historical approach, but it actually worked super well for the kids. It was mono, bi, tri, and nomial, and I had pictures for mono, bi, and tri, and they were able to guess what was in the picture, like, oh, that's one of each thing, or that's two of each thing, tricycle, bicycle. So they already had some vocabulary that helped them break down those root words. And then we did a card sort to name polynomials. So during the card sort, they had to talk with their partner, why are we naming it this? And they had a word bank that they had to use during that process as well. And if you ask them, they still remember mono, bi, and tri. So I feel like that was very successful. So lesson 2, I did solving quadratics by factoring. We did a sequencing activity. So what I did was I broke down the steps of each problem. Each step had a sentence with it, so they had to match the sentence with the math step. This one, my kids just kind of wanted to blow through the math part without doing the steps or without even thinking about what the steps really were. So we had to take a time out and slow down and start over, and I had to hammer home, like, you guys have to look at the sentences. You can't just pair up what you think goes together. And we had a word bank for that as well that they had to use while they were talking with their partner, which was, again, they just wanted to snap through it, especially my high kids just wanted to get the activity done. The lower kids really paid more attention to what they were doing, which was good and bad. Lesson 3, we did completing the square. I gave guided notes. Sometimes our workbook is a little wonky with how they present information, so I'll just rewrite it, especially if it's super, just a lot of sentences that aren't necessary. Lots of word problems with just crazy amounts of information. So I broke that lesson down and did guided notes with a word bank, and we used manipulatives, so algebra tiles in that lesson, and we ended the lesson with a find someone who. And I didn't just let them go and like give no scaffolding to it. I divided up the room into parts, and everybody from a certain part had to pick either the front or the back. So, and then the students picked a problem. I checked the problem to make sure it was right, and then they were released to find someone who. So it wasn't just, hey, here's 14 problems. Good luck. It was a lot of breaking it down, making sure everybody had a problem done. We didn't have enough time to finish, but I think it would have been a better activity if we had more time. And differentiation, I said that instead of going straight to the problems for my lower ELL students, they can keep using manipulatives or draw it out. I had a couple of kids who just kept using the manipulatives and never really did it on paper, but they got the concept, so that's the important part. Lesson 4, we did methods for solving. So we did a structured sorting activity first, where they had to sort the problem with the method that they were supposed to use. And then they did a 4 corners activity, which was my favorite one. So each corner had a problem with a certain method. There's 3 methods, so it was really 3 corners, but 3 methods, 3 problems. The kids broke into the ones they hated. So if you don't like quadratic formula, that's where you go. They circled and wrote, like, I don't understand because. I gave them that sentence stem, I don't understand because. So they wrote that down, they switched groups, and then the other group answered their questions, and then we rotated back. So it ended up working really, really well. The groups chose a writer, so just one person was writing on the paper, and so not everybody needed to write, and a lot of it was just pointing, like, I don't get this, and then somebody else could verbalize, okay, we don't get this because we did this. So that was a really good lesson. Reflection, a lot of the ELL strategies just kind of spice up the classroom, give you some total participation, give you a little more in your toolbox to help get the students engaged and just get them active and working. I feel like I use my word wall a lot more effectively because I could refer to it and say, hey, use a sentence with this or whatever. So I feel like the kids got better at using it too. Like, oh yeah, that's on the word wall, let's look for it. And using the word banks, I didn't do a lot of that before, but I feel like now I'm more comfortable with it, and I feel like it's a really good strategy in math. So, that is it.
Alright, who's up next?
I just sent in because I uploaded it earlier, but I didn't hear you say my name, so if you'll open it, I'll go next.
I got hassles. Let me check my spam.
I literally just emailed it to you. Or it's on.
Oh, there it is.
Should we upload them too, or is the email okay?
No, email's fine. I hate accessing anything through Moodle, so. There we go. Okay, all yours.
Wow, that's really good. As I was planning, I was more cognitive of students' academic language in the way that I taught vocabulary and kind of switching that up to add more like pictures and have the kids kind of tell me what it meant to them. I added more opportunities for students to talk to each other about our content. In my classroom, I used to have them not talk so much because it would always go every other way. But if I gave them more direction, I noticed that they stayed on topic and they really do like to talk to each other about the things we're learning. Also started using pictures for everything and having students label things in their pictures that they drew to help them with their writing. And then adding more in their writing and speaking. So this is some examples of our oral language. I did this project where we were learning about jellyfish, and we made these it was Jello, and so I had them touch it and
I
kind of.
wondered what you did. When I was reading your lesson plan, I was like, oh, she did
I
that.
had them touch it to kind of feel what a jellyfish kind of felt like, and the objective was to teach them about what happens to jellyfish if they come out of their habitat, wash up on the beach. So we rolled them in oatmeal and it kind of dried out. But they got to touch it and talk about what they were noticing or every phase of our lesson. And I didn't even tell them that it was jellyfish, and one of the kids actually made the, I said it was an animal, and they actually made the connection. So, and then up here, we've been doing a lot more partner work, and we do this thing now called Brain Inscribe. It's the same stuff we learn here, but everything's named different in elementary school for some reason. But one kid is speaking, and then the other kid writes it down. So if it gives an opportunity for your lower kids that are confident with writing to kind of say their thinking, and then the other kids write it, and then they can switch. And then this is just a picture of us working together, and they're talking as they're working. My domains of language. For listening, I always use Partner Talk, and I have them, I think it was you that said you have them say what their partner said. I think that's really good, because then if they aren't confident in their answer, they can just blame it on the other kid too, so they can repeat that. And then I have them repeat back things after explicit instruction as well, to kind of show me that they're understanding and comprehending the language that we're using. For speaking, having students answer questions or share ideas with a partner, and then I just assess this by walking around and monitoring. When they're on the carpet, I'm always listening to what they're saying. And then for reading, having students read out loud to me, and also with partners, and kind of correct their mistakes. For writing, we're always using dot charts, and I have them pick words off their dot charts to write sentences to show me that they are understanding the things that they're putting on there. They're not just putting them on there to add more words. So these are the strategies that I used. Like I said, they're all called different in elementary, so I don't know what the real names are. But this first one was for our jellyfish. We did a picture splash. So this is what we start off with, and they kind of told me what their background knowledge was of all of it, so that we could make that connection to our lesson. This one is called linking language, and I think it was called what's it called? There was the E something, I can't remember. I'll look it up later.
That was linking language too.
So we have a picture. This one was for our habitat. We have a picture, and then they're just making their connections to what they see. They have no idea what we're going to learn about, and then once I tell them, we can kind of connect what we learn. And then we use a dot chart. And then this one is where they have their paper and they walk around, and someone else and the lower kids can pick it, whichever one it is. For differentiation, I started doing this for vocab where they write the word and then they draw a picture that relates to the word and then we come up with a definition. So I went back and just corrected their vocab so they would have it correct for when we used it later. And then as we're reading stories, sometimes I'll have kids listen to it read aloud as we read. And then I learned that all ELL students are different in their language capabilities, and the strategies are actually really good for all learners, not just ELL. And I realized kids actually do like to talk. I think I already said that. And then sentence sims I learned can be really good for kids, and then also really bad. Now I feel like my students won't do anything on their own unless I give them a sentence stem. So they'll say like, how are we supposed to start this, or what are you supposed to say? And I'm like, okay, you have to come up with it too sometimes. So that's what I learned.
Sweet. Oh, you get that in high school too. They're like, wait, how do we start that sentence?
Yeah.
I'll go next. All right. There we go. Okay, so for language development, I saw that when I became a lot more intentional about creating a classroom environment where conversation was just encouraged in general, whether it was on topic or not, then a lot more students were comfortable in participating in classroom discussion and asking questions, answering other people's questions. So just really being more intentional about creating that positive classroom environment that encouraged conversation. And so I started asking questions, and you guys had mentioned, you know, having a partner and then having that partner summarize what that person said. So I did that as well, and I used that for both content learning and for brain breaks. So doing like a fun social question, or summarizing steps for a problem, or how you would describe a vocab word in your own words. Also, having graphic organizers and foldables played a large part in defining and organizing that information and new content. I use a lot of graphic organizers and foldables because I feel like like Evelyn was saying, the workbooks can kind of be very wordy and overwhelming, and so using graphic organizers and foldables make it easy to find the steps or the definitions for whatever we're working on. For student interaction, some lessons are easier to plan for student interaction than others because of just what we're covering that day. Sometimes if the material's kind of dry and it's just a lot of rote learning, what I'll have students do is trade papers or trade workbooks and kind of grade each other at each step or problem, and that way when they grade each other, first of all, they love criticizing or correcting each other, having that interaction, and so it was a great way for them to interact and like congratulate and celebrate each other in their success, and then also be able to not just mark it wrong because it's wrong, but for them to know why it's wrong and then be able to explain to their partner, okay, this is where you went wrong and this is what we should do instead. 4 domains of language. For reading, there's popcorn reading, because not every student gets called on. A lot of times the popcorn reading happens for word problems or just a little passage or paragraph that we might have in our workbook. I also observe students while they're working independently, because what I've noticed is if a student is just sitting there and not necessarily doing anything and they've just got this blank look on their face staring at their paper, most of the time I've found that they just don't understand what they're reading or they're struggling with that. And so really just reading my kids' faces. For writing, that has been assessed through stuff like quick writes, comparing and contrasting, 3-2-1 charts, KWL charts, what do you know, what do you want, what do you wonder, and what have I learned. So, yeah, and then I also do binder checks, and I observe who's taking notes, who's not taking notes, and at what level. Like, are you just writing down the bare minimum? Are you writing down every single thing that I write down and not taking any ownership in it, that sort of thing. For speaking and for listening, I've done a lot more small groups in my classroom since I've been taking this class, and that's been really, really good. I am always monitoring when we're in small groups or partners, and for students that are not as engaged, if they're quieter in whatever we're doing in small groups or as a whole class, then typically during independent work time, as I'm continuing to walk around, I check in on students to be like, just say, hey, how are you doing? Do you have any questions? That sort of thing. And so on the students where I noticed they were quieter or not as engaged, I would kind of casually stop by there and ask them to explain something to me, or just ask different questions to probe them into explaining something, just to kind of better assess where they're at. And for listening, I do a lot of just informal assessment of body language. You know, do they have blank stares? Like, are they moving at all? I also notice who always has to have the directions repeated like 3, 4, 5 times, or who just doesn't do anything, like just sits there and waits for someone who was listening to remind them or to bring them whatever materials they needed, anything like that. And then I've also done activities where we kind of chunk word problems. Instead of them seeing a word problem and getting overwhelmed by so many lines of information that they have to go through, we'll read aloud a word problem sentence by sentence and kind of chunk it that way. So read a sentence and then write down what information do we know, or draw a picture of what do I picture in my head based on that sentence, and then adding to it as we read more of the problem. So for strategies, I did two of my lessons were in my Algebra 1 class, and 2 of my lessons were in my geometry class. I really wish I would have done what Evelyn did, because I feel like it would have helped me to kind of organize my thinking a little bit better. But I learned how to apply it in both of my classes, because I felt like it was really easy for me in my geometry classes, and then I struggled a little bit more with it in my Algebra 1 class. But that also might be because I only teach 1 and I teach 3 geometries, so I just focused more on geometry in general. But for my first lesson, and for all my classes, we always do a word wall, but for that lesson number 1, that was really important because it was in quadratics, which Evelyn said was really vocab heavy. And so throughout the whole unit and throughout the year, we build this list of vocabulary, key terms, main ideas, and a lot of times on our word wall, we'll put pictures up as well, and even examples. Like if it's something that they really struggle with, we'll put up an example problem along with that main idea. And that really helps, because students are always looking back there, especially towards the end of the unit, where it's like, okay, what do I really need to know for this test? There's all these notes that we've taken, but what do I need to make sure I've got down? And then the last lesson that I did modeling, and this was in our stats unit. And so what the activity that I had was basically they became their own researchers and collected their own data and then organized that data. So I modeled it first by giving them a scenario or a question, and asking the class, okay, so I am the school nurse and I want to know what is the height of a typical 9th grader. And so I would go around the classroom and I would ask each student, how tall are you? And then I would write down all my data, I would organize it, and then I would put it into different plots that we've been learning about, dot plots and box and whisker plots. And that was really helpful for, first of all, giving them ideas of, okay, what kind of questions should I come up with? And then how to behave when you go around and collect your data, like going up to the person saying, how tall are you? Or so that way, because everyone came up with a different question. So modeling was really helpful there. For my geometry classes, we read aloud, especially during our trigonometry unit. We were working with sine, cosine, and tangent. We had word problems where they didn't give us a picture. And it was really, really helpful in the word problems to stop sentence by sentence and draw a picture and label that picture with, okay, this is how far Sally was standing from the flagpole. And this is how tall the flagpole was. So what was, how cranked was her neck? Like, what was that angle of elevation as Sally was looking up to the top of the flagpole? And that was really helpful. And we also worked on whiteboards there, and they just love whiteboards. So lesson number 3, we did a graphic organizer that kind of summarized the characteristics of different kinds of quadrilaterals. And we used pictures and wrote out the similarities and differences between those quadrilaterals so we could figure out, okay, a square is a rectangle, but a rectangle isn't necessarily a square, that sort of thing. Differentiation, lots of scaffolding, especially on just what we've been doing lately. There can be a lot of steps for a problem, like quadratic formula, or how to factor a trinomial and that sort of thing. And so listing steps to be taken, providing the big X or the box, so providing different resources to kind of scaffold and hint, let kids know this is what we need to do to complete this problem, instead of just leaving it with blank space and letting them run wild with it. And then also identifying what page or what example number to look for so that they can have a similar problem to look back on in their notes to help them on homework, or if they take like an open note test or something like that. And then also sentence starters and word banks, especially when reviewing steps and procedures for different problems. So listing those steps to be taken first, and then having the word bank to list that vocab as well. And then the reflection. So one of the biggest things that I feel like I've learned is just being more aware of the L students in my classroom. I felt like I just wasn't really aware of them in the first place. And so being aware of my students and aware of what am I doing to help my students, and not just assuming that, oh, they're quiet because they're just quiet. So, yeah, I learned a lot of different strategies that some that I learned like, oh, that's really cool, I've been using that and I didn't even realize it. Or other strategies that I really want to continue to incorporate in my classroom or in the future incorporate. So yeah, and also listing clear objectives. I'm terrible at writing goals and objectives, and so that's one thing that I've really been working on. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. All right, Mr. Hassel.
Yeah.
Okay, which one's yours?
Yeah.
Sure.
I don't know where we're going. I think we're going to Chipotle. This is the island getting
All right, it's all you.
All right, so
Passage to India.
I started out with planning, planning for language development. So I start each of my lessons with like a quick bell work activity that kind of builds background, and it goes back to what we learned in the last class too. There's always some kind of question that brings up whatever we learned in the previous class. So we're always going back and forth, back and forth. So we never just give a vocab word, we cover it, and then it's not heard of again. We're constantly going back and forth between them. Planning for oral language development. If you come into my classroom, it's usually pretty loud. I encourage them, a lot of conversation. Each time I plan my lesson, I'm always trying to think of like one thing, at least one thing every lesson I know is going to get their attention. I know it's going to hook them, and we're going to have this conversation. And one of the things in the lessons I did for this was we looked at a picture. I related that picture to flags, like the French flag is red, white, and blue. And then as soon as I can start talking about Mexico, like everyone's going to start talking. Even the kids that aren't from Mexico, they're going to want to start talking about their country. And it just triggers conversations, and conversations are awesome. Like anytime I can get them comfortable to where they start talking, it's great. So some of the strategies that I used throughout these lessons was, this is what I start my lesson with. I always start with a bell work, and I think this is kind of boring, like I really do, but there's reasons that I do it. One is like it's the first thing that they come in, it's the routine. They know that, hey, I need to sit down, I need to get my pencil out, I need to just start getting to work. And second, it does build that background information, and it gives them the vocabulary that we're going to cover today. I adapt this. My lower level ELL students know that they can just copy the definition and we can go from there. My higher level students are working on summarizing, rephrasing, so they will put the definitions into their own words. And even if they just get the definition out of the textbook, I'm fine with that, because we're going to cover this vocabulary a lot throughout the unit, so I know that they're going to get it. One of the things I did is a collaborative study guide. I used this strategy to help students prepare for a test. I basically paired students up, I gave them a study guide. One student would ask the other student a question, the other student would then find the answer, read the answer back to them. If they both agreed that that's the correct answer, they'd write it down on the study guide. And that would be what they would use to study for the test. The adaptions I used for this was my seating chart. My classes are really small, so I know all these kids like amazingly well. And I've constantly been adjusting this seating chart. So when I say pair up, the partner is like usually a high level with a lower level, or I know the groups that are going to work best for something like this. So another strategy I used is quick writes. Quick writes are awesome. I love showing images where students can just think about what they see, what's the meaning of it. And quick writes are great because they actually get to think for themselves first. They write it down so they can think about their responses before sharing them with the class. So it gives them a few minutes to kind of, okay, well, what do I see? They can formulate what they're actually going to say. So you remove that anxiety of not knowing what you're going to say. This is really good for adaptation. Some students are just going to write, okay, I see the color red. I see a guy on a horse. Some low-level responses. But then you're going to get the higher-level questions too, or higher-level responses. And I prompt that with the questions that I ask. Okay, so you have a guy on a horse. What's he doing? What's he wearing? What colors do you see in this picture? And you can see red, white, and blue. So what does that mean? And you can go on from there with different conversations. So I love quick writes. Another strategy I use is marking the text. Students, everybody knows the three things that they have to do. Is first we number the paragraphs, and then they circle key terms like names, dates, places. You can see on here they have them circled. And then the last thing they do is they highlight important information. The first part of this, like circling the key terms, they're just skimming through it, not even really reading it yet. And then they start reading, and that's when they do the highlighting. We've been working on this since day one, and now they can do it super quick, and it's a really great strategy for getting through these big texts. One of the things I've done to modify this, with reflecting on it from this course, is now I have them write down 5 facts that they learned from each document that we look at. And then we show them out at the end too. So that way we're using all 4 domains of language. So over the course of my lessons, I really shift the focus to including all 4 language domains. So the strategies that I use, I'm now trying to cover all of them. If they don't, then I'm adding something to it to where we can. So the example of that was the marking the text with the sharing. Assessment-wise, I think listening and speaking are very informal, whereas the reading and writing I assess through a finished product. So marking the text would be an example of are they getting what they need with the reading, and then answers to questions would be the writing side of it. So yeah, that's all I have.
All right. Well done, everybody. That is it. Your final is up and ready for you. It is open notes. You have 2 attempts to get the best grade. Take your time. Be organized when you take it. That way you don't have to sit for 2 hours. It is, I feel, intimidating to be on the computer. When I took the class, it was still a paper pencil test, so I don't know, it just felt less stressful. Anyway, that is up. If you enter an assignment that has a 0, email me so that I know that you added that. I try to make it very clear, Moodle is not tell me when you add assignments, so if you add something, just give me a heads up so I can go back in and fix that grade. Discussion board due today, presentations due today. I do have to close the class out next Tuesday, so I will take assignments up till Monday at 6. That would be like a week from now. Surveys were 25 extra credit points. What questions do you have for me?
On the final, will it show us what our grade is, or will we have to wait till you?
I think I have to go in and grade it. I'm not entirely sure how it works, because she's like, well, it works just like the quiz, and I'm like, well, we didn't technically take the quiz because it wasn't on our syllabus or on the grade book. So, I
Or it
know
wasn't even
you,
available.
did you take it?
Yeah.
No, I did not.
Shawnee took it, and somebody else did the practice. It's the same thing I gave you. That was the printout. It's exactly the same. So, there's that. I will grade them as soon as, if you shoot me an email and say, hey, I took the final, I will go in and grade it
Oh, so
pretty,
the grade
pretty
won't
quick.
show up.
I don't know how it's going to show up.
Yeah, 'cause then we don't know if we got the best grade or not, because then we wouldn't know to take it again.
Gotcha. I will grade it as quickly as possible. I think I can put scores in next to it, but like because Shawnee took the quiz, there's nowhere for me to like do anything, interact with the test. But the test looks different. With the quiz, the final looks different than the quiz, but there's none up so that I can actually interact with it, so I'm not entirely sure what it looks like from my
Because it
side.
could end up giving us some sort of grade, maybe.
It could. Because there's like 4 multiple choice questions, but there's like 2 that I have to go through that are reading. That's not true. All of them except the last 2 could grade itself, should grade itself, because they're right there. They're true, false, multiple choice, or matching. The last 2 have the writing piece to it. So, when I emailed her, she's like, it's just like the quiz. So I didn't email her back for clarification. I will, like I said, I will let you know as quickly as possible. I'm pretty sure it'll tell you, because the quiz gives you feedback automatically. It tells you what's right and wrong. It just doesn't tell you your answer. Does that make sense? It doesn't tell you your score.
There are questions where you have to write an answer.
There's 2 that have a response.
That's probably why you have to.
And they're not, it's like pick 2 aspects of the PSYOP, I think. And then one of them is pick 2 parts. All right, I'm too organized.
I showed it last week. They look pretty easy.
It's not hard. It's really not hard, I don't think. And like I said, you have to get your notes out. If you practice the quiz questions are one whole question on the final is the same as the quiz question.
When you say get your notes out, do you just mean like those methods that we went over the last couple of weeks?
The
Is that what you're
methods.
talking about?
You're gonna look
I have like a ton of packets.
that. For the first question, that's what it's gonna all be. CALA, SIOP,
Okay.
TPT. Oh my gosh, I have them somewhere. What did I do with them? I thought I stuck them in my book. But they are going to, there's like a true false questions that ask you about, in this scenario, you would do this, true or false. In this scenario, you would do this, true or false. I don't know how I lost them already, because I literally just printed them before this hour. So,
And that's due Monday.
yes.
Monday.
And
Monday-
We don't have class Monday, or we do?
We do not. We're done.
Okay.
Yeah, all you have left is the final and the discussion board if you haven't posted to the discussion board, and
The survey is.
the survey if you want the extra credit points. Let's see. No. But they're in here, and I'll find them as soon as you guys all leave. But yeah, other than that, that's all I got. I will know probably next August what next August looks like. They don't ever give me any kind of indication really
Do you think
a
I'll still
whole
be
lot
here?
before. As long as they don't break up our cohort, you'll be with me. The only way, oh, here they are. Ah, I need to ring you. The only way they would do that is if they got more elementary school teachers. And they build an elementary cohort.
But we, I guess. 'cause we're
But it
already
wouldn't be
through
the
it.
same rotation, so that's why I don't know for sure. Okay, so yeah, question 1 is all about the methods. Question 2 is determine whether the following statements are true or false concerning oral language. Question 3 is a multiple choice. Question 4 is a multiple choice. 5 is a multiple choice. 6, developing a good vocabulary is essential. Explain the difference between content vocabulary and academic vocabulary. Give 2 examples of tier 3 or tier 2 words you might teach. And then defend your answer, basically give content examples. And then 7 goes with that, the PSYOP. Give 2, I don't call them aspects, what do they call them? Pieces, parts, steps, I can't remember what words they use. So, yeah.
Is it timed?
No,
Okay.
not timed.
Oh, that's good.
And like I said, you can attempt it twice, so.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Yep.
Have a wonderful day.
See ya.